Sam. How are
Hi,
you, Sam?
I'm good. I'm gonna try to stay as long as I can today. So,
Well, you are very sweet. You've been very busy traveling, work, etc., so forth.
yeah,
So how do we feel about Jane Eyre at the end here, Sam?
I feel like she should have just chosen no one.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. It's terrible that that wasn't an option in the novel, was it? It's funny how that works.
Right, right. It was like either the one guy who wanted her just to be like his helpmeet, and the other guy who was incredibly toxic. And I guess back then it was looked at as very romantic. But now it's like, oh, this novel didn't age very well.
Like, yeah, they don't get to update it. They need like the
Yeah.
historic chat GPT changing it a little bit. It's like, yeah, no, this guy's not too great in different things.
Yeah.
No, it is funny. I do like I shared with you that quote, that particular one where he's like, if I were to render this prison apart, the soul would fly free. And it is very interesting that when it comes to love and relationships, what you're after is something that cannot be taken. It has to be cultivated, or you have to attract it, or you have to sort of convince the person to engage in it. And maybe he didn't. Maybe our dear Jane was convinced a little too easily. But that sort of idea that when
Hmm.
we're dealing, it's very interesting. I mean, when we're dealing with human beings, we are dealing with something that is there and yet not there, like a kind of will, a kind of spirit that we're trying to resonate with, and that you're always trying to locate it, or what exactly resonates with it, and yet isn't reducible to that resignation. So I always find that tension quite interesting.
And I think it's interesting too how the meaning of the novel kind of changes over time. I think back then it would have been seen as Jane has a lot of courage, and she almost like surpassed her suffering in a way because she chose to stay with him,
Mm.
or go back and stay with him, Mr. Rochester. But now I see it as, especially, and I was talking to Sandy about this the other day. When you like, when you're a woman and you're 19, you would look at the book very differently than when you were 30. And looking at it as I'm like closer to 30, I see it as more of Jane was a very vulnerable character. And so she was kind of trapped in a way by this Mr. Rochester. And there was no way of her knowing that this was a very toxic situation.
Mm.
And I think it would be a good book nowadays to teach girls how to kind of be prepared and see past those what's the word for it, past those illusions
Mm.
that are set up for them, and also for men to see that, hey, playing hot and cold with women and playing all these mind games is not healthy. So I think Jane Eyre would be very important in that context today. But that's just my opinion. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of different ways to interpret this story. So,
Well, that's fascinating, and it is very interesting. I think literature really does show you kind of sociologically the difference between sort of givens, like how I like to talk about belonging again, sort of the givens and the releases of what's
mm-hmm.
accepted is kind of given that this sort of relationship structure is a good thing, or it's normal, or it's something that's good to participate in. But what you can see
Yeah.
is, say, if you were to follow the great these great novels that are following, say, romance and relationships, how those change in accordance with the societal givens. Now, as those societal givens go away, you may be less likely to end up in a toxic relationship, but then it may be more difficult to define what a relationship is at all, or what you even
Yes.
want, because it is not given. And so there's this, you're released from the givens, you're kind of freed from stumbling into a toxic relationship you don't even know is toxic. But that comes at the expense of you yourself having to navigate or to define relationships in your turn and what you want, which then is when we're all existentialists now. We all then are having
Yes.
to deal with existentialism.
Yeah. And I see this so being so prevalent in society today, where we have no idea what we're doing, because what happened was we broke down those structures and we said, well, now I can do whatever I want, and I can be whatever I want, and I can set the requirements for my love interest to be how I want them to be, because it doesn't matter what society says, I can set it up myself. But when we actually put it into practice, we have no idea what we're doing, because I feel like this is a very new thing that we're actually starting to break down societal structures. I mean, I think throughout history, there was a gradual breaking down, but recently, I would say that the internet plays a large part in this. Recently, it's been like moved very fast, whatever that word is. And I don't know how we would almost pick a point of departure and then go from there. It's like we're just kind of like throwing ideas around at each other, like, and it's almost like men are over here saying, this is what women should do, and women are over here saying, this is what men should do. And the problem is we're not actually sitting down and saying, like, we both don't know what we're doing and we need to figure it out together.
No, that is extremely well put. Because, because the issue is when you don't have givens, it's like you have only notions. And so have people notions of what relationships are and what they should do, but how do you determine which of those notions is the one you should really go with? Or that it's, it has like an authority, or it has some sort of possible connection with what is best, or what is, actual in a kind of deeper way. And so that leads to all sorts of existential anxieties and different things. So everyone is throwing spaghetti at the wall. And then as there turns out, there's not even a wall in which we can determine if the spaghetti sticks or not, because not even that is given anymore. There's just the kind of desperate throwing, of which creates a kind of radical exhaustion and things like that. And yeah, I mean, if you don't have a social order that sort of makes it given what relationships or family or dating or all of these different things are, then it becomes up to each individual to define those things. But then, of course, relationships can be just expressions of ego, expressions of preference, expressions of what like you want to do, which then is counter in its very essence. Like that's just counter to what a relationship is, right? The moment you are relating, you're talking about something that is not egotistical, or something that is at least trying to transcend certain bounds of egotism. And so there becomes a certain tension, a certain kind of contradiction between what is how relationships are defined in terms of the individual and what a relationship is. And when you have that tension, then there's just a whole lot of confusion. And there's a whole lot of pain, frankly, and a whole lot of misunderstanding. And when you have that level of misunderstanding, then, different bad things can happen from there. And then, what kind of happens is when people are confused in that realm of perpetual misunderstanding, it makes me think of your video where you talked about the danger of suggestion. I really love that, on how suggestion sort of moves people along. Well, when people are confused, indeed, the way they're very, very susceptible to suggestion. And just notions. No one kind of in a very hard and forceful way forces them to change their thinking or mind in a certain direction, but they end up kind of absorbing a secondhand smoke that pulls them along. And that leads to all sorts of, that leads to just kind of being manipulated or being controlled. And then relationships also become just kind of products of suggestion that are pulling people every which way. And that can be very, very, very difficult, I think.
Okay, so you were speaking to the power of suggestion, and it's interesting because when I was younger and in high school, I read the book Brave New World, and I didn't pick that up for some reason, and I don't know if it was because it was taught a certain way. Usually in high school, it was taught very much as like a summarization of the book and just a couple elements in the book, and it didn't really dive any deeper than that. But I think it would be important for, like, if this was taught in schools, for students to understand just how powerful suggestion is, And everyone, I mean, everyone is susceptible to it. It doesn't matter where you are. Even if you're in a cave, you're still susceptible to the power of suggestion of what happens in that cave. So it's dangerous in society today when we don't believe that we are susceptible to this, and we think to ourselves like, oh, I always have an original thought. That is not true. Very rarely, actually, I think, do we have original thoughts. I think a lot of the time, our thoughts are based on our surroundings, or how we've been raised, what we've been brought up with. And then I also talked about in the analysis about how so you have people who don't believe that they are susceptible to suggestion. And so what happens is you have these groups that start to break off, and then they become so far from each other that they can't even communicate with each other anymore. And if you remember at the end of Brave New World, the two kind of become entertainment to each other, the pain and the pleasure side of it. The society who is all about pleasure, they look at the savage inflicting pain on himself, and they're just like, this is just so, hi Michelle. This is just so this is just so crazy that this would happen. And so it's almost like watching a car crash, like you can't turn away. And then the savage, he's looking at the people the society who is all about pleasure, and he's like, it's just mind-boggling to him. He's like, why would this happen? And so now each side is put in a place where they cannot communicate with each other, and it is so dangerous, because I think, and I see that in society today, we're just getting farther and farther and farther away from each other.
That was excellently put, Dimitri. Michelle, wonderful to have you. And what you were saying, there's a phrase I've heard before, reality tunnels, and where you've got two different reality tunnels, and they increasingly lose the ability to understand one another. Because you see, the thing is, however you form your society, you also formulate your values, your ethics, and whatever. And if you follow them, they're not merely that, you see, if you truly follow an ethical system, they're not just possible ethics, they're like the ethics. You can't help but feel that way, because if you didn't feel that way, they wouldn't compel you the same way. Yes, you have to and can, in your philosophical theological system, have openness to variance, but the variance has to almost be, I don't want to say performative, but a certain level of like, it's not as deep as what you do. And so what happens is, when givens break down, as we talked about, everyone can then form their own society. Or if it's no longer given, that's, say, living in the brave new world of pleasure, look at all these gods and goddesses or whatever, say, the Tempest is the best way to do it. Well, then you form one like the savage does it at the end, that has its own givens, and everyone is in the reality tunnel, and you actually kind of lose the ability to even communicate with one another, because worldviews kind of are also language. Like, your worldview is not merely the way you see the world, but it also is the conditioning of your communication about the world. And that also radically impacts the ability of other people to communicate with you and for you to understand other people. And you see, it's like when you read Jane Eyre, like you were mentioning, Jane Eyre is located in a certain quote unquote reality tunnel of that day and age. And now, as you're in the kind of reality tunnel of 2023, you look back on that and say, oh, there's some sort of problematic dynamics there, which one then unveils for the possibility of escaping sociological givens, because it's no longer given that that's the way of relationships. So you're freed from falling into a toxic relationship you don't even know is toxic, or from falling into a world of infinite pleasure that you don't even realize is soul crushing because you're too busy getting the soma or whatever. well, when you're free from that given, you're released, but then you're forced to become an existentialist of yourself. You're forced to undergo great existential anxiety in determining, oh, well, what reality tunnel, what way of life, etc., so forth, should I live? Because now it can be chosen, which frees you from forms of oppression, but also kind of overwhelm one existentially, which then can make it appealing to return to the pleasure, or return to the closed-minded, or to return to the toxic relationship, as we're mentioning with Jane Eyre. All because we all are searching for, it is very difficult to not have some sort of center around which things can orbit. And yet, in order to escape an oppressive orbit, one has to leave it. But now the earth is unchained from the sun. Who can save us, from this murder, Nietzsche, parable, and so forth and so on. So those are some thoughts to come to mind. Those recent videos you've done have been really, really remarkable, Sam, and I appreciate them very much. So I'll pass it to whoever would like to speak.
Nice. Anyway, great to see you, everyone.
Great to see you.
Daniel, Michelle, Samantha. Yes. So philosophy, spiritual practice, literature are all means whereby we go into the anxiety of being caught up in language and the tragedy of that, right? Like you guys always emphasize the tragedy of literature, of being in the world where tragedy is two goods against each other. It's not like, oh, this is bad, this is good, so I side with the good and then it's over. Now, I'm hesitant to say if going into that gives you more anxiety. Sure, at the moment, it is quite anxiety provoking, but anxiety is such a universal emotion, that I wouldn't say that, oh, those guys over there, they're not doing that kind of stuff. They're less anxious. They don't have to deal with the crap. No, everyone's like having to deal with their own problems, right? So I wonder how your view is on that. Now I obviously I guess I feel like I always bring kind of the same story to these talks, because to me trauma is so central, and whenever I think of the subject, I think that the subject is traumatic, and that the trauma is the point where experience breaks down. And I feel like, this kind of universal negativity that we all experience, then there's like, Freud had this word, it's called the reaction formation. And basically what I'm trying to say is that the subject as such is universal. It's maybe even ahistorical insofar as all of humanity has had to deal with the trauma of being a subject with anxiety. Now, the responses to that are massively different, right? So I would even say that patriarchy is a reaction formation to the existence of women. The anxiety that the woman can provoke, the fact that she cannot be pinned down by a man, that there's a structural impossibility of her to submit, and and that's something like this. So the class system is, I guess, another way that this is being done. And of course, consumption is one way that people deal with their problems. Just consuming your anxiety away. I guess that's one of the attempts. Another attempt is, maybe it's quite controversial what I'm saying, I don't know, I think it's very true. I think like most people are socially masochist. I think that basically that ties in with what Nietzsche called the slave morality. Like, the thing is that, if you take a Marxist lens, like most people have to kind of be put into the underclass, right, for the system to function. Now, obviously, they don't want to be caged like that, but for them to continue living, they have to adopt a mode of life, to continue living, which, like Zizek will talk a lot about, just like Peter Sloterdijk, is that, well, Zizek would say, like, they're forced to adopt a mode of enjoyment to, make their own situation livable. And of course, this is completely obscene. I guess fucked up situations, whether it's oppression or just poverty or whatever, there's some kind of enjoyment to that. And cynicism is one of the things we do.
Okay, I'm sorry. The internet's been crazy right now.
Welcome back.
It's raining outside. The wire has fallen. Country over internet was overloaded. Well, I'm glad y'all had a good
I'm gonna leave you alone. Don't forget this one.
Oh yeah, our internet went out this morning too. So
yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm glad. I never know if I get cut out, if the whole call crashes. So that actually makes me happy that it keeps going even if I get cut out. That's good to know. So I'm sorry. Well, Dimitri, you said a bunch of wonderful things because I wanted to comment on it.
Respond to it. I'll watch it back.
Yeah,
see you later.
Very nice. Good to see you, Dimitri. Thank you for coming by. And as Samantha picks up the crowns, I'm curious. A few of the things you were saying, it was like, yeah, I mean, I think that's why kind of these simple categories of like enjoyment, good, bad, are very problematic because indeed, when people work a job that they hate, they often will have to come to terms in a way where they like the thing that they hate. Otherwise, they won't keep doing it. Likewise, in relationships, if there's a difficulty, they're interested in a kind of rationality. And so it really doesn't do to simply ask, do you like it or do you not like it? Because those categories all blur. Precisely part of the trauma is the collapse of simple categories. Like that's a really kind of key dimension of trauma, is that you realize good and evil are always tied together. That the human brain can't calculate complicated events. It doesn't know how to interpret it. All these things shatter in that there's a radical trauma in that. And I think with Dimitri, he also asked that question on anxiety. In Belonging Again, we talk a lot about existential anxiety, kind of the anxiety of existence. You could also get into stress, tension. Everyone definitely has a kind of existentialism, especially today. Because today in pluralism, globalization, after Nietzsche, everyone has this existential tension. But there is a difference between that kind of existential anxiety and, say, the tension of not knowing what you want to do with your life, or if you're Jane and you're going to marry Mr. Rothschild in the back then. So I think there is a difference between those things. But today, indeed, most people are defined, or everyone's an existentialist today, like the book tries to say. Everyone today has a certain existential anxiety. And that's a defining feature of the world. And you are a champion multitasker. I salute you, ma'am. A champion multitasker. And so having to be an existentialist with all these different tensions, it certainly is alive today. Because like the entire sociological order is frankly defined as a breakdown of givens of which stop existential tensions. And so that completely changes things. And then people can be more susceptible to power and suggestion in all of that.
Ariel just came in the room.
Oh, good old Ariel.
She was like, I can't hear it, Mom. I can't hear it. So now I've got the two with me. Okay.
Nice. Miss Ariel Swift. That's my favorite tomato picker. Very good.
All right. So he mentions ambiguity and the class systems and how they're all broken down. And it made me think about Crime and Punishment. And so there are two classes that I saw formed right off the bat. And again, this is just my opinion. This is just what I interpreted. So take it with a grain of salt. There's lots of different interpretations to this. It's a huge book. But what I saw was there you've got the unfortunate and then the nobles, although I would kind of like to call them the false nobles. So with the unfortunate, they're kind of put in I say kind of, but they are put in a mode of where they have to survive. And from that survival, they kind of form this nihilistic way of being, and they find out themselves above the law or the laws established by that society. And then they find themselves above these laws because they have to survive. They're like, if I follow these laws, then I won't survive. And so they start to get into this vicious cycle of so Raskolnikov, he murders the pawn woman to get money, or to get her items, to make it so his sister and mother can can have a better life, and his sister doesn't have to marry Petrovich.
Right.
But because he murders the old woman, he's put in this position where, okay, now he has to escape. And in order to escape, he has to get rid of the other woman who ends up being there, which was her stepsister, I believe. And I liked how you brought up in your comment that one day about how you're kind of like forced into, how did you put it? Can you say how you put it again?
I'm muted, right? Well, I was talking in the
Okay.
comment how there's a tension where when he kills the additional person to the old pawnbroker, it kind of leads a question of if he would have felt guilty. You brought that in your comment, which is very, very good. And it also just kind of arises to the question of this idea that in society today, you have that basically pure will is able to overcome any sort of moral guilt, any sort of consciousness in Rise to Occasion, and he's going to prove that. But of course, once he proves that, he finds out that he can, and then he can't come out of it. And what Dostoevsky is so much pushing back against is the idea that if we just created the perfect environment in the perfect society, then people would not be so destroyed by their they would be perfect. They wouldn't have the moral guilt. They wouldn't have all of these different tensions. And what you see in Raskolnikov, because he perfectly gets away with it, someone else is accused of the crime, and he's not able to come out of it. So there's some sort of inner life. And you can contrast that with the false nobility, which is a great phrase, whereas they kind of achieve a perfect environment, right? They have money, they have all these things, and yet they're nihilistic. So you kind of see right there that Raskolnikov, whose name I can never say, would not actually achieve what he think he would achieve if he were to gain that place, right? And so Dostoevsky is exploring those on all those different points, which I just thought you brought up in your video very well.
Yes. So you have those two sides formed where they're both thrown into this vicious cycle. One thrown into that vicious cycle, the unfortunate because they have to survive, and the false nobles because they want to keep the power. And in order to keep that power, they have to throw the unfortunates under the bus. And then I also noticed the two other groups that came out of that, which is it's kind of hard to tell unless you're really unless you see this cycle, I think. And that's the people who are the oblivious. And I would say that's like the Resmusicans, who are like, just get up, buddy. Just get a job. Don't be so depressed. And I think they don't see that cycle, partially because they don't want to, and partially because it's kind of invisible. They don't understand that level of suffering that the unfortunate are going through. And then from that, you also have the people like the Sonias who emerge from that, from those three, who she's almost like a Jesus character, where she lays down her life, and so she suffers, but she says to herself, I'm not going to be above the law. I'm going to suffer. And it's almost like she surpasses that that suffering, and it almost turns into a sort of grace, and then an unconditional love. So a lot of people don't like the very end that Dostoevsky put in the book, but I actually love it, because I think it shows how through suffering there is still a capacity for unconditional love.
I think your take on Sonia is excellent. Javier, good to see you, sir. And and it's almost like Sonia, a character like that, is almost what is required in order to kind of break through this human tendency, like Dimitri was getting at, to find pleasure and pain, pain and pleasure, dissatisfaction and success, misery and having everything you want, and then getting married to your misery in a way that keeps you contained, or ending up in a brave new world of Soma, or ending up in a world where you're just hurting yourself maybe for no reason, or any of these different ways that the brain could go. You almost have to have someone that says, I'm going to go against the rationality of whatever reality tunnel I am in, and I'm going to see good in you. And it's utterly non-rational. You know, we talked about rationality, irrationality, and non-rationality. And basically what Sonia puts forth, I know with the epilogue, there's kind of the idea of sin as a plague and it spreads, and then everyone is contaminated and there's really no way to come through. It's a lovely sort of way to describe sin in the Christian construction that Dostoevsky is putting forth. But it's almost like when faced with the problem of reality tunnels, or what I'll call the problem that map is indestructible, ideologies are indestructible, the only thing that can kind of break through all that is something that is kind of crazy. And yet it's not crazy, it's actually non-rational, and it's the only way to deal with the Nash equilibrium situation in game theory, which is a Nash equilibrium is where if everyone is rational, you get a suboptimal result. Like if everyone is rational relative to their social conditioning, they either stay in the brave new world, they never get any texture to their life, they either stay in a state of capitalist misery and never question it because they find a pleasure in it, like Dimitri was saying, and so on and so forth. So you have to have a Sonia that actually sort of like the idiot, you know, Sonia kind of maps on to Prince Miskin and the idiot, and arguably maps on to the second redeemed Alyosha and the brothers Karamazov, in the same way that I think Raskolnikov kind of maps a little bit with Smeridov in the brothers K. And Smeridov is someone who just murders the father. The world would be better off without this person. He's kind of a monster and doesn't murder someone else. So it's kind of like just the pure question of can the human overcome this guilt. And what's kind of funny in Smerodov, in the brothers Karamazov, it's actually horrifying to everyone that he doesn't really feel guilt. Like he actually kind of does achieve what Raskolnikov wants in the Crime and Punishment, and it's actually like, oh, he is the devil then. It's kind of funny, like the goal of Raskolnikov is actually if everyone, like the Ubermensch, the overmen, because I do think Nietzsche's kind of, there's a little bit of speaking to that possibility in Dostoevsky, is like actually the devil. It's actually the worst thing ever. And that's actually another thing that Dostoevsky is pointing at. So if the choice is between, it's very interesting in Crime and Punishment to have Sonia as this unconditional grace, if you will, or unconditional love, contrasted with this individual who tried to get this kind of unconstrained ego, an unconstrained power, an unconstrained person. It's like, I can kill people, or unconstrained good almost. It's like, because in their mind, the world's better off without the pawnbroker, right? You know, and the brothers Karamazov, the world's better off without the father, right? It's like an unconstrained notion of goodness that doesn't have to check and balance itself with a love that transcends simple social organization, like comes forth in Christ. Like Christ can't be understood within any kind of social order. Any social order he comes into, he's too radical to understand. So you have to kill him because he's it's this crazy guy claiming he's God or something, right? And so Sonia, as a contrast with Raskolnikov, really does, I think, very well paint basically the same choice that societies are dealing with even to this day. I mean, Raskolnikov, in a way, is kind of like a transhumanist. He's a kind of like a personification of a transhumanism. This kind of idea of being able to transcend the finite consciousness, finite guilt, kind of achieving something that's beyond the human. And Sonia's like, no, that's precisely when you lose human. You know, transhumanism, when, the great accomplishment of mankind is precisely when mankind is not there to accomplish anything. And I think Dostoevsky saw that ahead of time quite well and was warning about it in many different ways.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see you all. So I was thinking lately about like something that often like you'll tell kids about, like, treat others the way you want to be treated. And I was wondering if that possibly, I was thinking about that in conjunction with the logic of the same, where I'm like, is that kind of teaching a logic of the same? Is this something that could be slightly redemptive for the logic of the same? Because in a way, you are kind of saying to like, I guess was getting a little bit like introspective and thoughtful on like that expression and like that phrase, and is it always right? Are there times when that's wrong? And, I guess what I mean to say is like people, and this is like to some of the thoughts that that Javier, you've brought up on like the idea of forgiveness and like forgiving the unforgivable and things like that. Oftentimes people have a hard time with that because it's almost like treat others the way you want to be treated. And somehow I feel like that could maybe possibly be like, I guess I mean to say is that it could potentially fall into, well, I'm being compassionate, so you should be too, right? Which makes sense, right? But it's like the whole idea is to be compassionate. You know, that's when it really kind of means the most and is almost most meaningfully compassion when it's being compassionate towards somebody who's uncompassionate, right? Or who it's hard to be compassionate with. And so, yeah, I guess I was just thinking about that. I don't know if that's like really phrased correctly or something, but those are my thoughts on this because it seemed to tie in. I didn't catch everything on what you're talking about on Dostoevsky, though Brothers Karamazov is one of my favorite books. But yeah, and Guilt's very interesting with that. But that's kind of my thoughts that were percolating as I heard the discussion.
That's excellent. I'll give it to Javier. I think George Shaw once said that, you know, don't treat other people like you would want to be treated because they may not like it. I always thought that was really hilarious. And there definitely, I think, are some different risks with it. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera. Javier, good to see you, sir.
So yeah, Michelle, she brings up a good point. I think even Lacan talks about how the same thing you brought up, Daniel, where Lacan kind of says people actually treat themselves horribly, right? They don't necessarily treat themselves with the kind of respect that you would think another human being should be treated, right? So I think there is this question of like the unconditional that I think can fall into a healthier logic of the same, because I think unconditional would sort of actually break that logic in some ways and yet remain the same. It's weird, where we can perpetuate a sort of unconditionalness towards everything that we encounter. Of course, that's the challenge. That's what we would suffer for, ironically. And that's why I connect passion to suffering a lot, actually. Because being passionate about something, no matter what reasons or what obstacles arrive, if you're passionate about doing that said thing, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really deter you from stopping to do that thing, right? And this is like the distinction between passion and desire, right? Where the moment desire fails, you're kind of like, maybe I don't want to do this anymore, you know, right? So passion is this persistence that you're willing to suffer for. So in that sense, if you can corroborate passion with, I'm going to use your language, Daniel, vision. If you can corroborate passion with vision, I think we can have a better logic of the same, basically. If we can choose to have the unconditional for the conditional, just like the play on Derrida's, can we have the, forgiveness is for the unforgivable? Can we choose to have the unconditional for the conditional? And that's the great task that we'd have to be passionate for. Recently, I kind of discovered this distinction also between that we're passionate about problems, but we desire solutions. So that means that the moment that the solution fails, we kind of get angsty and we want to just take it in our hands. So there's this interesting interplay between being passionate about an issue and only desiring a problem. This is why I like to say people desire nonviolence, but the moment that seems skeptical and not working, they're going to resort to violence, right? So, and that's because they're passionate about the problem, not necessarily passionate about the solution. And I think you even make a distinction between we should try to prevent solutions, using that word as of trying to solve things. I forgot the word that you used, but I'm pretty sure you could bring that up. But yeah.
Excellent. No, I think we have to think a lot more in terms of trade-offs. When we have so much kind of emphasis on solution, that's problematic. And definitely there can be a danger where you say, oh, I'm treating other people like I want to be treated. and you kind of shut down and stop thinking and paying attention to if they actually want that, or if it's actually just, you see, we define what's good according to our worldviews. And so then if we impose that notion of the good on other people, it becomes oppressive, right? Like we think it's, we think it's good to have a job that makes a lot of money. So we pressure the people around us to get a job that makes a lot of money because we want other people to do what we want to do. And that is, you see, that's an example of the oppression of givens that Sam and I were talking about at the beginning. Like it's given that you get a job with high paying money. It's given that you say, go into, you do this on Wednesday night or do this on Tuesday. It's given, right? And I do it, and it's what I would want to do. So therefore it should be what you want to do. And actually that's a kind of a step that occurs. If it's like not our trip, we start saying it's like becomes a moral code of what they should do. Because if I want to do it and I want other people to be treated like I'm treated, and basically that turns into I want other people to be who I am. You see how it's a kind of slippery slope. Then it becomes a they ought to, and now I need to help them do it. Now we've gone down the slippery slope into oppressing other people. Dang it. Shoot. You start off with a nice moral code, and then now we have this. And that's what can occur when there's not when that phrase is not taken as merely kind of a baseline. Like for very general things, like do to other people what you would want done to you. Like, so for example, you don't want to be killed, so don't kill other people. Great. You don't want to starve, so don't take other people's food. Great. But as you go to more complex problems, like more particular and specific problems, that's not going to do. Like if you say, well, I would want to be in a relationship with a computer coder, so I'm going to set my friend up with a computer coder. Not the same, that's not the same situation as the generality of regarding the very general category of not wanting to starve to death. And it does seem as if the principle do unto others what you want done to you is like for general, like very, even like kind of concrete biological realities, right? Like very like don't push someone. You don't like being pushed, so you don't be pushed. But as you become more meta, it's almost like more meta or abstract the problem, then it's going to have to narrow into something more empathetic, more paying attention to their particular differences and being open to those particular differences. So there's a movement there up the stack.
Yeah, I really like that idea of like, it's almost like it's holding a type of, how do I put this? It's almost like a logic of the same that holds difference. So the sameness is the difference. And this is also things that like, Javier, you've developed like and talked about that a lot too in the past. And I think that's really, really important because then what the, essentially treat others the way you want to be treated is a type of expectation, right? You're setting up, this is what you should, this is kind of the expectation of behavior or how we engage with other people, all of that. And I think that this idea of like, well, yeah, the only condition is the unconditional, therefore has bothness, right? It has the both, it has the difference in the same. So what the expectation then is actually holding a space for always the outlier, like you hold space for the outlier and for the thing you didn't expect. And that's where you show the grace, because it's really, again, only really truly meaningfully grace for the thing you could never really anticipate. And that kind of goes outside of expectation. So it's an expectation. It's in a way, I want to say it's kind of like an expectation for the unexpected or something like that. So the logic of the same is to hold the difference of the condition is the unconditional, or like showing unconditional love, when that is. So it's kind of like somebody saying, well, here's what we could say as treat others the way you want to be treated. If you did something that you would consider unforgivable, would you want to be forgiven? And the person might say like, well, I don't feel like I deserve to be forgiven, or I don't feel like whatever. But ultimately, I think most people would hope that there could be some hope for forgiveness, unless they just kind of give up or something. But the hope is for to be forgiven, right? So in that way, there's like this bothness of like, it feels unforgivable, but there's the hope for forgiveness that you would hope for yourself, that you would then extend to other people. You know what I mean? So I hope that's. But anyways, just basically like the sameness. What is the same there is also the space for difference, or the bothness. You're holding both, and you're extending it to both parties, right? To both people, or to whoever you encounter. But then I'm glad you brought up Lacan, Javier, because I was thinking too. It's funny, like on the basic level, you're right, Daniel, right? Like the biological things, like don't slap somebody, don't all of those simple things that you would be like, oh, I wouldn't want somebody to hit me in the face, so I'm not going to hit somebody else in the face, right? But then it does get into like a lot more complicated things of, the fact that Lacan and psychoanalysis will often reveal like we don't always know what we want, right? Or do you even know what you want? Do you know yourself well enough? And this also speaks to Nietzsche. Like, how can you love your neighbor if you don't even love yourself, if you don't even know yourself, And so I think in the more nuanced and complicated ideas of this, it speaks to this idea of like we have to really get comfortable or get more familiar with ourselves, perhaps, or something like that, or always recognizing that we may not really know truly what we want, but that holds a space for the sense of difference, right? I can't even necessarily know my own wants. How can I know it for somebody else, right? How could I speak to what somebody else should want or does want or anything like that, And I think like you experience this, like I remember, you can sometimes experience this idea of people really feeling their own decisions challenged by like if you make a decision, okay, it's the hard part about sometimes, like there's a lot of things that can be hard about making decisions or choices, but one of the things is that it can sometimes say things to other people who have made different choices, right? Or people can read into that choice, or they can be like, well, you chose this, wouldn't you want to choose something like this? I mean, especially when you get into like parent-child dynamics, it's like, well, I provided all of this for you, wouldn't you want to do, was that not good enough? If you make a different choice, what does it say about this choice that I made? It's very existential. And I think though, if we get into the Lacan and the help of psychoanalysis is to realize this idea of like, well, at the end of the day, it is going to ultimately just be a choice, but even that choice is informed by sometimes things that we are, a want that's not necessarily clear, but because want is not necessarily a good barometer, because it can sometimes fluctuate. It also is sometimes unknown, or the thing you're going for is not something you would ever reach. Then you have to ultimately just go with choice, which is in your control to a degree. Yes, it's going to be influenced by things sometimes outside of your control, like your conditioning, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, there's the choice. So I guess what I mean to say is like, I just think that's helpful. Like if we pull in psychoanalysis to this idea of treat others the way you want to be treated. Well, on the biological simple level, that's very easy to understand. On the more higher level end, we have to understand that the complication of wants and desire, and then also realize that means we cannot be so judgmental, basically, of like what should somebody else want, or anything like that. Like when it comes to interrelation. So, yeah, that's just what I wanted to say. Hope that made sense.
No, it makes me think like, one, it's precisely because we don't know what we want that suggestion can control us, just like Sam was saying in one of her videos, like, so we can be suggested into things that then oppress us. And then also the problem becomes in the Brave New World, well, what's good for you is Soma. Like, I want Soma, you want Soma. So then everyone like enforces that upon one another. That's problematic. But let me give it to Sam.
When you guys were both talking about, Michelle, I loved when you were talking about treat others the way you want to be treated, because I think about that often. When I was younger, it was very easy to think of, oh, well, you just treat them with kindness and compassion. But then when you get older, you realize there's a lot of context to it. And it's like, oh, this is really complicated. But it made me think of Heidegger, because I was studying him the other night, and how we need to like approach how, I'm not super far in the book, but like he was talking about approaching things as they are, and let me get my notes. It's really hard to like actually articulate it.
People have been trying for 100 years, Sam. Don't worry. I've been literally going back and be like, bing, 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 bing.
Let Javier go first while I look through my notes.
All right. Just like I think Samantha is alluding to, like the context matters in this case a lot. I think Daniel, you even one time argued in a paper that grace has a kind of violence to it. So this idea, yeah, this idea about, trying to do unto others what you do to yourself. I think we can reframe that in the sense of focusing on the context, right? Focusing on what the other needs, right? And so in that case, if we focus on what the other needs, I'm not thinking about what I would need. I'm thinking about what the other needs. But I also need stuff, so that way it's kind of the same in that sense. But if we focus on what the other needs, it kind of makes us think about the context. What does he need? Does he need kindness in a sense, or does he need more of a aggressive like assertion in this case, right? Because maybe kindness isn't really just taking. You know? It's like when Adam Phillips said his best parenting advice was just be what the child needs. But that takes a lot of context to know what does the child need. And you can't treat every child the same. You can't treat all your children the same because they all need something different. So not every method works. There's no universal method to parenting. But there is some type of context to which you can pay attention to participate in that need. So I think we reframe that phrase as paying attention to the needs, all the needs that we would like to have, and include that context. I think we can reframe that in a sort of healthier fashion rather than just going with givens. We can make the context the sort of mystery that we can participate in when we engage with others. But yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have our new golden rule, and I'll give it to Sam. And I do feel like it's very Heideggerian, actually. So, contextualize others as you would want to be contextualized yourself. So, we have our new rule, our new golden rule. We'll call it the platinum rule. We'll call it the meta golden rule or something. Something of that nature. But please, Sam, I think Heidegger is very good actually on this, where you're talking about the letting be, the clearing, and so forth and so on. So, contextualize everyone. Contextualize others.
Okay, so it's on page 67, this book for the context. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, that's a new translation. We got a page number. We're straight academics. Well done, Sam.
Okay, so it was the line where he says, which beings are to be our preliminary theme and established as pre-phenomenal basis. And he was talking about how we want to, the problem is we want to establish the beings, like the things, as the pre-phenomenal basis, when actually it's something else. And so I put in my notes, I said, approaching things like children where the expectation has not been met or interpretation has not been met yet, aka forget everything you know, and move with an intuitive curiosity. Thus, a new interpretation has been met through this taking care, which can now be moved from the non-everyday to the everyday if you do it enough times. So that's just what it made me think of. And it was just fresh in my mind from the other night.
I think that's a fantastic fantastic incorporation. I'll give it to Javier, unless his hand is just still up from last time. But yeah, that's what I thought. I'm also very impressed. You remember that Grace Flannery O'Connor reference of Grace being violent? That's very nice. You get a gold bead. A glass bead, I suppose, a gold star. Very nice, Javier. No, there's definitely Heidegger is so concerned about that hermeneutical circle, where you can never access the thing itself because you're in a loop of interpretational problem. And so I think it's really important to see his philosophy, his emphasis on clearing, on letting being be, is a response to the problem of that hermeneutical circle. Like if interpretation of a thing is always getting in the way of the thing, then you just need to like step back and let it unveil itself and actually interpret. Now, of course, once it unveils yourself, you have to interpret that. And so it keeps going and you have to like interpret it to make it intelligible. But then the moment you make it intelligible, you've reduced it to a box. So now you have to release it again, then grab it, release it again, and the life of the mind can never stop. And I think that's really important because philosophy after the Enlightenment has been in the business of finding a final resting place of quote unquote certainty or truth and then being done. And that didn't go so well. So we have to change that. And Heidegger is certainly, I really do agree with that professor, Dr. Sean Shema, Stanford guy, person who really says we need to emphasize in Heidegger the clearing aspect almost more than the being. Like this whole, like there's a big emphasis in Heidegger on being and the question of being and letting being, and obviously he put it in the frickin' title of his book, so it does matter. But like Heidegger's method of the clearing of letting things come forth as themselves is like paramount, and it's a solution, a kind of solution to the problem of the hermeneutical circle, which then if we're treating it to people, like we basically are in the business of interpreting people and then deciding they are that interpretation, and that creates oppression, right? But if instead we were to resist that or deconstruct that tendency and let things come forth, in the same way that we would hope that they would let us come forth. So maybe it's like clear unto others as you would want to be cleared by them. We can do this all day, with different phrases, but there's something like that at work. But let me give it back to Miss Harris. And no, I think that understanding of Heidegger in terms of clearing, and then actually as just a note, really to understand Derrida, like really understanding that idea of clearing in Heidegger is paramount for Derrida's deconstruction, but as just a note. But let me give it to Sam.
Okay, yes, I was just going to say, I wonder if the way to actually put this in practice is through language. And so I had an example here where I said, I first say, I know everything about philosophy. The interpretation has already been established by a temporal point of departure, but if approached as I know nothing about philosophy, then it gives room to learn philosophy. What has been established is nothing, which gives room for everything. So it was kind of like how you were talking about continually releasing it. And then, so by saying, I know nothing about philosophy in the non-everyday, then once the moment is made, we are continually putting ourselves into a position to learn philosophy. So if we continually put ourselves in a position to genuinely learn about another and want to communicate with another, then it so if we go to somebody and we say, I know nothing about you, like if we had a friend and we approached them every time as, I'm ready to learn something about you, like I don't know anything about you, I'm ready to understand who you are. So I feel like maybe that could be a way to approach it. Now, I don't know exactly for sure, but it's just an idea.
I think that's magnificent, because I definitely think that human beings like to feel like when they encounter people that they're a kind of surprise that the other is open to. You like to feel like a surprise that the other is open to. Like if you feel like you don't want to feel unknown, like they don't know you, but then you also don't want to feel like they totally know you, because they don't. Who the heck do they think they are? So there's this weird kind of balance between wanting to be known, but also not wanting to be unknown. And so it's the same where it's like you really feel kind of alive when you feel like a surprise the other person is open to, because then you have something to share, you have something new to bring, you have a mystery to unveil that they want, as opposed to are trying to avoid. And that kind of makes a little life to life. Like when you show up to people and it's like small talk, and Heidegger is going to talk about chit chat. And it's very interesting that he makes such a point to talk about the problems of the they and the chit chat and all these existential layers you have to go through to get to the place where philosophy can occur. In chit chat, you don't feel like a surprise. They ask, where are you from? I'm from Virginia. What do you do? There's no surprise in this. There's just a script, right? No one's actually looking to be surprised by one another. In fact, if they're surprised, they're kind of angry at you. They're like, I'm just trying to make small talk. I don't want to get into the meaning of life. Don't do that. So they're actually not happy. And so then you feel kind of smothered because you're like, why am I doing this? And there is something about language that seems to be a kind of testing of the nature of the relationship. Like language unveils if it's just a they, a das Man, I think is the term Heidegger uses, or if the language is actually a trying to cultivate a soil so that something grows unexpected. And language provides a kind of sense of the nature of what the people involved are looking for or open to, or things like that. So, yeah, and Heidegger does this whole thing where he's basically like, hey, to do philosophy, we have to give up all of Western philosophy. Oh, okay. So it's like anew, right? It's like you're letting it go so that philosophy can strike you anew because it's not in a preset complex. Well, likewise, we as human beings like to feel like we're not in a preset complex when we meet people. We don't like to feel like we're boxed in. And Heidegger's like, well, we have to do something similar with philosophy. We can't box philosophy up before we start it, because if we start from a box of philosophy, it can't relate to us. It really is not going to relate to us in a deep way. Well, the same goes with people. Like when you box people before you meet them and you don't let them surprise you, they're like the relationship's almost dead. Like it's automatically dead, right? And indeed, people feel alive Unless I say this, but then there's something about people that if they're not ready to be a surprise, it could be an uncomfortable feeling. So there has to be some work to get to that place. But there's something optimal about this being a surprise that other people are open to, and also the feeling of someone being a surprise that you're open to and the excitement that comes with that. So I think incorporating Heidegger in those terms is quite good. And that could bring into how Heidegger goes into Buber and philosophical developmentism and other things we talked with Javier and Trey and so on. But let me pass it on to Michelle.
That was all really good, guys. Thank you. Not to harp on this, but I'm gonna harp on it. I guess I just was thinking about like how much it does get more complex with this whole idea of like treat others the way you want to be treated as you get into like adulthood and, you know, relationships beyond just how, you know, just beyond the simplicity of that. Because, for example, you know, it can also get, I don't like these terms very much, but let's just go with them for the sake of the point. You know, if somebody is more introverted and another person is more extroverted, but they're in a relation together, then, you know, treat the way that, like, let's say the extrovert wants to spend their morning could be very different from the way an introvert wants to spend their morning, you know? And so it's kind of like, well, if you think about it in the framework of like, well, wouldn't you want this? Wouldn't you like this? Like it's very difficult because then, you know, treat others the way you want to be treated suddenly collapses and it doesn't actually function. It doesn't actually work. And I think that's where, you know, well, it really opens up that like, wow, people are really, really different. You know, people have very different orientations to even a day. And so, yeah, I guess I'm just thinking like, I wonder what it could be like. Yes, I think the clearing is really important because first of all, when that doesn't work and you realize, oh, I'm like my understanding of how what somebody else might want is different, or I'm basing it purely on what I would want, then, you know, it kind of like gets you out of yourself, right? And it kind of now is like, well, what, you know, there's other subjectivities, right? And so that's the first thing. That's good. And that's what I think the clearing can help with, right? But then how do you get to kind of a place where you can inhabit the clearing together, you know? How does that happen? Is it just the simple kind of like relational vice of like, it's just compromise, you know, what is it? Because I want to understand that on like more philosophical level. So that's kind of the question. Because, you know, you don't simply just clear and clear and clear and clear. Usually when you're going through, like if you're, you know, bushwhacking and going through the forest and stuff, hiking and stuff, you know, you get to a clearing. You kind of actually find yourself in a clearing all of a sudden, right? Like you almost have to allow the clearing, right? Sometimes the more effort you're trying to like, you know, you have to just sort of keep moving along forward until you kind of get into the clearing. So, okay, there's kind of two parts to this question. The first one is like, you know, how do you inhabit it together once you've done the clearing or entered the clearing? And then also, is clearing, in what way is it passive or active? You know, like, do you actively like make the clearing by literally sort of wiping away your presuppositions or your assumptions about the other? Or is it kind of like just moving along forward to the place where you find yourself in the clearing? I don't know if that second question is very good, but those are my thoughts.
No, I mean, that's outstanding. I'll give it to everyone. I mean, for Heidegger, clearing is removing of kind of like preset ideas, categories, preset notions, things that get in the way of what the thing is being itself and its phenomenon, right? And so, like, in a relational context, if you remove all your ideas of what, say, dating is supposed to look like, what a weekend is supposed to look like, what different things are, then you're open to the actual others, where then you can begin to figure out, okay, you being you, me being me, like what would it mean to relate in terms outside of the everydayness, the das man, the they? He talks so much about the they. And you could really, in a relational context, say that a lot of the clearing is not thinking according to the they, like absorbing like what other people do and then moralizing that as the absolute, because that's actually going to get in the way of the relating on a more authentic level. Now, Heidegger is not going to stop simply with authenticity, because authenticity is to get to the place where being can be. He's not merely an existentialist, but existentialism is a necessary step to getting to the ontological, to getting to those different layers. So those will be the first thing. And then Yeah, a great argument against like Heidegger as a autonomous being as opposed to structured within a philosophical developmentalism, because there is this kind of hanging question, the same with Derrida, and this is where I go after Derrida. Not after him, because I really like him. It's just the point that I think he's still a Kantian at the end of the day. Hot take is that nothing's allowed to enter the clearing that actually nothing meets the criteria of what enters the clearing. Because it has to be a pure being, basically. Well, if it has to be a pure being and everything is ultimately a pan-dialecticism, to use Bard's term on Hegel, well, then nothing can match that criteria and you have a problem. But if you're making a clearing for becoming and making a clearing for difference that can become together and enter into the becoming other of Hegel, and that's why I would also put Hegel in the philosophical developmentalism, that changes things. But the first thing I would say, and then I'll give it to Javier, is that so much of the clearing, like, basically, without the clearing, the terms of the relationship end up being defined by the they, or the chit chat, or the kind of notions of how relationships should be. And that can get in the way of authenticity, get in the way of the relationship being what it actually is in its unique calibration that can only be found between those people. And very often, like, society actually moralizes not clearing. It moralizes not actually trying to get beyond those categories. Because if you do get beyond those categories, then what are you? Different. And everyone hates difference. No matter how much everyone says they love diversity and difference, people do not like difference. They do not like it at all. They don't like it. And we ought to guilt Sanduni to be here because we're going to have a talk about that. So we all need to call up Sandy and be like, Sandy, we're going to talk about how they're like, no one likes difference. Because they don't. Like, people, like, because difference is what makes you uncomfortable. Like, when you encounter someone who, say, is of a different religion and they don't make you uncomfortable, it's actually not really difference in that instance, right? Like, it's like it has to have a certain uncomfortable level to actually be difference. Well, once you define difference that way, as opposed to simply a array of different people with different ethnicities, genders, and different things like that, oh man, difference really sucks. It's almost like it's almost like a game where ideology convinces you that you like difference if you have people of different nationalities of different things, because then you can tell yourself you like difference without ever actually confronting difference. You see what I'm saying? And so that actually is a big problem, because you have a lot of people that think they like difference who don't, because no human being naturally likes difference at all, because difference is different from you. Like, that's difference. It's different from you. And different from you is like ontological. It's not merely an accidental characteristic, like the difference between blonde and brown hair, white and brown skin. Yes, those things historically absolutely signified social class difference and different things like that. So back then that would have constituted a real difference. But the point is that if difference doesn't bring about the uncomfortableness that we are describing, whatever that may look like, and only you can know if it's bringing about that uncomfortableness, then you're not dealing with difference. And basically, there's a real way what Heidegger is saying is like, hey, if you don't have clearing, you actually never encounter real difference, because the social categories and the social structure is actually designed to keep you from encountering real difference, all while making you think that you do encounter difference, so that you can tell yourself a story where you're open to difference when you're actually not. And that would actually get into phrases like do unto others what you want to do, because you say, oh, I believe that, well, therefore I'm open to the other. I love my neighbor. No, you don't, because you don't actually meet them on their own terms. So even a phrase like that can kind of function in a sort of ideological machine to convince you you're open to the other when you're actually not. And so a lot of the clearing would actually be necessary to go through to find out if you're actually open to the other in the relationship, as opposed to just think you're open to the other in the relationship. And then one goes from there. But let me give it to Javier and then back to Michelle.
Yeah, so it actually, I've been making this distinction between openness. Direct openness actually is actually what's impossible. I'm gonna frame it this way. Every time somebody says that they're open-minded, they're actually closed-minded against closed-minded people. So it's ironically a not openness, right? So this question of can we really approach openness, clearing, in a direct manner? My understanding is no. I don't think we can ever approach anything directly. So it means that, what does it mean to approach openness indirectly? The way I like to frame it is the way I'm trying to understand Derrida's kind of interpretation of impossible, or maybe it's just my badly interpretation of impossible, but I still like anyways. If we make openness impossible, what's ironic about this is that it allows us to bring a sort of awareness to our closed-mindedness. And if we're aware of our closed-mindedness, we are ironically being open. We're allowing something to bring forth something new, something different, right? If I just acknowledge that I'm actually closed, not open. So there's this interesting thing where if I understand that being open is impossible, I can really encounter difference in this case. So I think that was an interesting point that I kind of came across. But yeah.
Oh, I love that point. I'll give it to Michelle. I think for me, this is why Heidegger, like fitting Heidegger with Hegel, is very important, because Hegel gives you, like, if you dialectically work through negativity, you get to the point where your category always fails, right? So like you have the clearing, but then if you go, no, I actually can't autonomously or perfectly or purely clear, it'd be like, exactly. That very meta realization is what actually then makes the clearing more clear. Like when you go, oh, I can't clear, then like it's more likely to clear. But you have to have that structure in the epistemology where failure is integrated into the structure itself. And so I'm not saying there's nowhere in Heidegger where this is addressed, but definitely for me, thinking of that, what that point you're making is extremely good. And I really appreciate it. But let me give it to you, Michelle, because I know you had your hand up before the phone died.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. Sorry, I missed what you said, Javier.
It was beautiful and poetic. Yeah.
I'm sure it was. Yeah. I'll have to check it on the replay. So I'll just do like a really quick story time. I remember this one time I was in college and I was going to, I made brownies for a friend, and this friend had a friend, kind of like he was hosting from Costa Rica. It's a long story, but basically, I was like, I will make them brownies, and I'm sure they'll really enjoy that. And like I made the brownies, and then I biked like all the way across campus and gave them the brownies at this dining hall. And I remember the one friend from America was like, "Oh, thank you so much, Michelle. That's really kind." The friend from Costa Rica like didn't say anything, like didn't say a word, like didn't say like thank you or that's very kind or anything. Like, and this particular person was actually very like just outspokenly nihilistic. Like he's like, I'm a nihilist, so like I knew, and that's fine. Like that's where his worldview was. But I remember after I gave the brownies to them, I was like, okay, great, enjoy, like, see you later. Left the dining hall on my little fold-up bike, and like rode back out, like across the campus. And I just remember biking and thinking to myself, I was like, wow, it was such a smack. It was like a really good smack in the face. And like, in terms of, I really like, do I really do things out of generosity? Like where I don't have expectation of thank you. Cause at first I was like, he didn't say thank you. Like he didn't even say anything. He didn't think it was nice. He didn't think it was like, he didn't say anything about it being like kind or whatever. And I was like, oh, wow, why did I do that? Like, was I doing it for praise? Was I doing it? Or like, was I genuinely just giving a free gift of something like, here's a token of kindness, enjoy these yummy brownies? Or was I in it for praise and being like, oh, wow, you're so nice and all of this. And it was, I don't know, to me, it was very eye-opening because I was like, I guess why I bring up this story though, is that Berman, that's the guy from Costa Rica, his reaction was very surprising to me. I expected that there'd be like this gratitude, even just a thanks, that's really nice. There wasn't any of that. There wasn't even like a smile. So I think it was very surprising, and I did not like it. To be honest, I did not like that, that there was no gratitude there. At the same time, so I guess what I mean to say is like, this is another thing to like lip service to difference and surprise. We say we want it, and we do. Like, who doesn't kind of say like, oh, I want to be like thought of as a surprise, and I want to be surprising, and I want the mystery, and I want the difference. But then when we really encounter it and it's anxiety producing and it's not nice or we don't like it, then we don't want it. We don't. But it was a good lesson for me because it's like, why am I doing what I'm doing? Did I really do this out of just a generosity of my heart where I didn't have any expectation for gratitude or anything, praise or anything in return? Or did I do it for a genuine, pure reason? Or did my own selfishness get in the way? Which it did, because obviously I was disappointed with the reaction, And it's like, so anyways, it was just very eye-opening. Like, can we do things for people? Well, first of all, can we do things and not have like some expectation of the return, right? Can we just truly give? And then also like the whole surprise, you know, can we be surprised and take it as like maybe a moment to self-reflect, even in that anxiety, even in that disappointment, even in that frustration, or even sadness, or, you know, heartbreak? Can we like take that moment for introspection to learn more about maybe our motivations, or where we're at, or why we're doing what we're doing, you know? So anyways, I just wanted to say that because I thought it spoke to the conversation. So yeah.
No, Michelle, I think what you brought up was so beautiful. I loved it because it made me think of how when we do things for other people and they don't reciprocate back what we're expecting, like the limitation is there now. We can see the limitation, and we see how we're not as giving as we thought we were. And so it's almost like a beautiful gift that is given to us, where we're like, oh, now I can reflect back and surpass this limitation next time, and realize that it makes me think of young Verta about how he does things for just a second. He does things for Lottie, and he kind of says like that he that he doesn't expect her to love him back like he loves her so much, but we see, like, to the contrary, he actually, like, he expects her to reciprocate those feelings, like, romantically, and he kind of like makes it up in his mind that she girls, just a second, girl.
They're so adorable when they laugh, though.
I know.
It's so adorable.
And now I lost my thought. So I just I'll pick it up when I have the thought again.
You're awesome, Sam. You're awesome. I'll give it to Javier.
So ironically, I actually do have a very similar story to Michelle's. Actually, I think Michelle heard the story too, where I picked up like some like strangers that need a lift. And it was crazy because this was the most bizarre experience where literally I was just like invisible to them. You know, I was just like non-existence. They didn't care about my name. They didn't ask any of that stuff. It was crazy. But I think this is what kind of gets interesting with the distinction I've been working on between, and Michelle helped me develop this too, between the object and the objective, right? Most of the time, I want to say that when we do things, we're going for some type of object of desire. There's something that we desire in this way. But the objective, ironically, is something more mysterious than we can actually anticipate it. My famous example is Lord of the Rings, right? What's ironic about Lord of the Rings, it's that it's so focused on the object, the ring, right? Don't put the ring in the wrong hands. Yet, ironically, the people that focus on the object get corrupted. But the people that focus on the objective are like, okay, this thing needs to be burned, needs to be thrown away, needs to be getting rid of. And what's ironic about the objective is that it allows these two characters to unfold and mature. So if we think about when we do things, we are participating in the objective that we cannot even necessarily anticipate. So that means that when we do something for somebody and there's something runs counter to that, I would say that's actually us running into the story, as Andrew would say. You know, that's us kind of becoming involved in the objective. A sort of development is occurring in that case, where you realize that it wasn't about your object of desire for gratitude, because somebody showed you counter otherwise. And I think the other nuance to this is that oftentimes we want to approach gratitude directly. I'm going to act as if I can expect the unexpected, right? I'm just going to frame myself in a way, and I'm going to frame myself to be open. I'm going to frame myself to have such gratitude and unconditional. But see, there's always something ironic about those things. It's that you realize it's impossible to do those things. It's impossible to hold a just limitless, forgiving attitude, a limitless basically, if you put yourself in this way, you put yourself in the harm of what psychoanalysis would call repression. Right? You're like repressing all these things that you're like, I'm just going to be this most angel and forgiving and unconditional. And yet deep inside, you're burning up, you're angry, you're upset, you're frustrated. And you can't do that, right? So there is a purpose for the impossible. But I think the purpose for the impossible is to sort of help us acknowledge not only our emotions, our frustrations, but it keeps the dialogue open about what it is. So yeah, there's more, but I think that's
No, that's excellent. I'll give it to Sam. It makes me think you have on when she was making with Gerda, the story of like a guy's like, I love you unconditional, I love you no matter what. And the girl's like, oh, okay, and walks away. It's like, what is she doing? I said I love her no matter what. She's supposed to, what's he doing? And then it's also like when you say unconditional love, I say it's like, yeah, it's really important to unconditionally love people. And that's why I'm having Joseph Stalin over for dinner. You'd be like, well, hold on. Like, let's backtrack with that unconditional thing. So like you always bring out these extreme examples, but the extreme examples unveil the overfitting, like where the model is overfitting and it kind of breaks at a certain point. And then we have to think that breakage. And that would be the meta, the breaking of the clean. Like that breakage is the Hegelian thought. Like you think the breakage. And what does that mean? But let me pass it on to Sam.
Okay, I know what I was going to say now about the young Berta. Okay, so he has this expectation that he wants Lottie to love him back. And all through, because he's an unreliable narrator, we don't really know exactly how she feels. Like it's very ambiguous. Like she says that she doesn't love him romantically, but is like, it's like, is it true? Because the way he's like describing his interactions with her. And I think it, in my opinion, I think it points to a much larger truth, which is we can never know. Like you can be like really, really good friends with somebody. You could like, you could be married for like 50 years and you still don't know how the other person feels about you. And there's like no way of actually knowing. And that can either, I think that can either put us in a state of like anxiety and hopelessness where we don't get out of it, kind of like young Berta, or we could see that limit of realizing, oh, I have no idea of like how that person feels about me and I'm just not gonna know. So you see that limit and you're like, okay, now I can turn in towards myself and be like, yes, I can give gratitude because I want to, not because there's any expectation. So that's what it made me think of. And then I just finished Animal Farm the other night. I've been doing a lot of reading lately, but a lot of classic reading. But it made me think of how Javier was saying how it's really, really hard to unconditionally love. And I think that Animal Farm points to that because it just takes one little alteration to make it all crumble.
Oh, that's excellent. And well, and the thing is about the unconditional, if one's not careful, well, then you have no condition to keep out that one little thing that tears it all down. And that's kind of, again, I mentioned Hegel, but like a realization in Hegel is like with A is A logic, then everything is incorporated, including the thing that tears it all down. Like when you have a totalizing logic, it has to include the variable of which undermines the totalizing. Therefore, AA cannot be the case except in a sort of tentative sense, or except just the mind relating to the mind or reality relating to reality, but we're always in the dual space of both, right? And then likewise, what you see in Brave New World is just the one savage. The one savage is a threat to the entire system as an alternative, in unveiling an alternative way of life. He has to go. He has to be out of the community. And I guess you could reference Girard at this point because there's a Girard quota on every single online intellectual conversation. But like this one person has to go. You can't be allowed. And likewise, Sonia, they have to kind of be too, they have to almost be kicked out of the system or viewed weird. Like they're too beautiful and too good to be part of the system. And likewise, they have to be the kind of person of who is going to get smashed, right? Like Sonia has to be taken advantage of, precisely because the system cannot not take advantage of a Sonia, because if you took her seriously, the entire society would completely collapse. And there was a comment on Girard that may or may not have made me laugh. So there's like, you'll notice in so many of these books, like these great works of literature, is this kind of arising of a variable or a person or a character or an event that if incorporated would break it all. And yet ultimately it must be incorporated, or it's a dictatorship, or it's like a bad thing. Everything goes to crap. Or precisely because it's not incorporated in the person's sacrifices, like a Sonia, or you could even say a Prince Mishkin, although I'd have to make that case. That's why it's so beautiful, right? Like that's why there's actually a beauty that comes out of all this. So I really appreciate what you said. As we come up on the close here, if anyone has final things to say, please. But I've really enjoyed everything that's being said. And then also, I mean, it's like when you look on a Jane Eyre or different things like that, like in order for the story to work, you can't have the consideration of the possibility that it's a toxic relationship, right? Or else the novel wouldn't have it. Jane would have showed up and gone and left. She would have just kind of left. So the story requires Jane not to see the alternative, but then of course the tension is that leads to the possible totalitarianism of Gibbon. So the system has to kick out the outlier, but precisely because it kicks out the outlier, it can be a totalizing totalitarian system in various forms. But then if the outlier is incorporated, the whole thing can shatter. And this can be both good and bad, based on different things. It's like this weird tension between, Michelle's making the point between like surprise and a good, we mentioned surprise in a good way, but then surprise in a bad. I almost want to do that thing where I do the philosophy move, where I make a distinction between terms. You know that move where the difference between surprise and shock, maybe, go with that one. So, what happens is like surprise has a kind of like good, oh, it's a surprise. Whereas shock is kind of like a kind of surprise, but in the negative. And it makes me think like so much of it comes back to me thinking in terms of that great tension between like the great emergence is either the Dante beatific vision or it's the Lovecraft creature that reduces everything to ash. Like there's something about the surprise or shock that's really, really important. Ariel, you're great. Like the best tomato picker. And there's of that. But if it's Lovecraft, it destroys us. But if it's beatific vision, it pulls us in. But then the funny thing is like, it actually has so much to do with our own conditioning, our own ability to actually mean it when we say, no, I'm making these brownies for nothing, or I'm doing this lifting, these people in the car for nothing. So there's a conditioning of our own ability to determine if it's shock or surprise, Dante or Lovecraft, and our own working. And then I would say reading literature can go a long way to teaching that, to allude to Sam's video on what fiction can teach us. So Javier. Javier.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I think you're I've always been wanting to do this critique about the psychology of distinctions, but of course, it's always funny because I think this becomes a debate of like who's doing sincere philosophy and who's doing insincere philosophy, right? Because I think we can always pull a move where we make distinctions between terms to show that I'm not wrong, to show I'm not false, my logic isn't flawed. There's just a difference, But anyways, I think I was listening to your talk the other day, Daniel, and actually it was funny because I was like, yes, this is what I meant when I said universal. It was the talk between you and Cadell, I think, when you said, actually, the problem is people just take propositions as knowledge, right? And I think this is the part about the unconditional. that we have here, right? We sort of just take the unconditional as like this propositional knowledge, like, okay, I'm just going to be unconditional. But actually what's unconditional is like a failing of striving for that unconditionality, right? So here I am going to make a distinction here where I'm saying we shouldn't have this propositional knowledge of what is unconditional, but instead we should try to live unconditionally, which means ironically failing by not being able to be unconditional, right? But by living unconditionally, I think this is why I like connecting to passion, because passion is sort of like the persistence in that suffering. And that's why it's always unconditional. It's sort of like exactly the way you like to talk about, Daniel, that internal drive that is not necessarily desired. But yeah, that was my brief thoughts on that, on living unconditionally by failing, rather than trying to live unconditionally by some type of success. Like, yes, I forgive somebody that I thought was unforgivable. I mean, I think that totally can happen, but I think it takes a certain amount of failings, and this goes with timing, to actually achieve that in the long run. So, yeah.
No, I think that's very well put. And yeah, I think it would be hilarious to do like a paper or video on the techniques and phenomenology of philosophers. So when you're talking about, well, we all want to be open and surprised, and Michelle's like, well, the guy didn't say thank you for the donut. I meant surprise with a capital S, not a lowercase s. I mean with a hyphen from the S and the U, okay? So there's always that. But again, the Hegel move, because this is another philosophy move where you say it's in Hegel somewhere, that's another technique you can always win. Just pick a philosopher who wrote a ton and say it's in there. You win. So, they're not going to find it. So like when you go like for Hegel, everything contains its destabilizing element. There's no such thing as like a experience of which is purely always good or purely always bad. It's always contextual, right? So there's a way when we say we always want to be like in a relationship, this openness to surprise, you're talking about this non-preconditionation or the conditionation. This non-precondition, the possibility of something coming through and then you responding to what came through that wasn't expected in a manner that receives it, right? And that's precisely what makes it exciting and alive, but that's also what makes it difficult and requires conditioning. It also makes me think there's something about like one of the mistakes is we place unconditionality as being a way we respond to things in the world, when really unconditionality should be something we turn on ourselves, where it's more like, I will not have a condition that people have to meet to relate to me, or I will not have a condition that has to be met for me to be happy, or I will not have a condition of which must occur so that I'm doing X, Y, and Z. And it's very interesting how unconditionality tends to be a way we think of ourselves relating to externalities, which is never the case, because we're not going to invite Joseph Stalin over to dinner. So therefore, there is a limit to our love or a limit to what we're open to. So we get confused about a lack of conditionality, where if instead we turn it on ourselves and start saying, I'm not going to be conditional in X, Y, or Z way, well, that's very different. Now, the limits to conditionality is always going to be ethics. In the same way that actually when we talk about equality or freedom, it's always ethics becomes the line. There's a paper on that where the lines are drawn in terms of our ethics. And that's why ethics is a very big deal, right? Like you want to be conditional towards, say, people committing terrible crimes, right? You don't want to be unconditional. But you see what's important there is the condition is rooted in an ethical system. Now, of course, ethical systems are a very big topic, so we'd have to go through that. But it's clear to identify the conditionality is rooted in that. But even still, to emphasize turning unconditionality on yourself to not be a conditional person, a lot of people will have things like principles, right? Like, well, it's my principle that people should do X and Y. And it depends on what you mean by principles, but principles can also be very dangerous because they do your thinking for you. And also they become something that people have to meet for you to relate to them. So Morgan, but I'll pass it to Michelle, but turning unconditionality onto yourself and thinking of yourself as being someone who doesn't demand the world to be conditioned in a certain way, as opposed to thinking in terms of unconditionality as relating to externalities, external phenomenon, I think can be one direction to take it. But let me give it to Michelle.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Daniel. I think that's really good. And I think that's a great way to think about it. Like, are we turning the unconditional on ourselves. And honestly, like that's only ever what's kind of like, you can, how to put it, it's like, yeah, I mean, we think about it in terms of like, there's a way in which you are thinking about the unconditional in terms of what you can extend or something. So it still ultimately ends up kind of being relational in a sense, but it's what you can kind of do, or I don't know, maybe what's within your reach, which is yourself. So I feel like that's really good because like I said, with the example of the brownies, like it was a moment to think, to kind of reflect, like, yeah, I did fail, right? I wasn't just like happy for, I was disappointed. If I was honest with myself, I was disappointed, right? But it was a moment to like think about, well, why am I really doing this? And am I always going to have conditions on my giving, you know? Or can I give with like truly like a spirit of like generosity and not expecting something in return? But yeah, I thought that was good. And it made me think about, like, it also made me think about Jesus, right? Where he doesn't have conditions on who he engages with, to the point that it even challenges ethics, because he's sitting with the tax collectors and the drunkards and the prostitutes and the lepers. He's sitting with all these people, and, you know, he's engaging with all of these types of people. And he seems to not have, you know, he's unconditional with how he engages with people. He doesn't see their condition as like, you know, literally like what condition they're in as like a determination of if you should engage with them or not, or even sit with them or not, with people or not. So yeah, I just thought that was good. I do, maybe a quick question for you, Daniel. Would you say then that this idea of like putting it on ourselves, I saw Javier's distinction on the reactive versus active versus reactive. I think that's really good to think about it that way, like, because you can think to yourself of what can you actively be unconditional with or something, but does it end up like, does that get blurry? I feel like that could be blurry. Like, sometimes that could be hard to discern, right? Because it always seems to be relational. You're being unconditional to the other or to others, right? So yeah, how do we kind of how do we get it to be more active and less reactive? Maybe just by being less reactionary. I don't know. So okay, that was my question and comment.
No, that's an excellent question. I think to the defense of philosophers who capitalize their surprise to get away with it, you know, philosophy ultimately does come so much into the business of very, very fine distinctions, of which unfortunately make a big difference. That's the other problem, right? It's like, it'd be one thing if the fine distinctions didn't matter. Unfortunately, they do matter. They make a big difference for how people live. Shoot. But there definitely seems to be something about a difference between unconditionality as extension and unconditionality as self-training. Like this idea of I'm going to extend a lack of conditionality in the world. Well, you can't, because the world is conditional. It is full of conditions. It's space and time and difference. Like the world is conditioned. It has determinants, as Hegel would say. So it really can't be unconditional. If you're relating unconditionally to the world, there's a way in which you're like relating blindly to it, because you're not taking into account the conditions of what constitutes it. So that understanding of like unconditionality as extension seems problematic. But when you think of unconditionality as a result of conditioning yourself to be open, and maybe a better world is open, you know, generally unwords are a problem in philosophy because they're defined in the dichotomy that's being questioned. Like the moment you use an unword, it's like against conditionality, and that kind of tracks the thought. So sometimes it can almost be better to use a different term like openness, but that's just another sneaky philosophy move to save their paper. But no, and generally, like if we think about conditioning yourself to be unconditional, which would therefore be open, which would be self-training, would be working on yourself. Now that's a kind of clearing, a Heideggerian clearing that you're doing to yourself so that being can be. So that phenomenon in their determinants can be what they are in their determinants and in their becoming and in their unfolding, to throw out lots of terms. So by taking unconditionality as an extension and pulling it into yourself to make it a training, then actually what you extend into the world is a kind of openness to the world. You kind of clear aside yourself for the world so that it can strike you in its being, in its phenomenon and what it is. And then people can do the same. And so that you can receive them on what terms they are. Now, The giant elephant in the room would be the ethics question, right? Now, if you open that Pandora's box, that's a big one. And basically what's going to happen, it's like the paper is called Equality and its Immoral Limits. And it's asking the question of like, what are the limits of equality that are not like violating equality? What are the limits of freedom that are not violating freedom? Because it has to be limited at some point. Well, that's ethics. Well, how do you determine your ethics? Boy, oh boy. But basically you have to at some point draw the line, or else you're dealing with something totalizing, and that breaks, as we learned from Hegel. Or you're now inviting Joseph Stalin over for dinner or something like that. And maybe you should have him over for dinner so you can poison him. I don't know. It just kind of depends. But turning the unconditionality on yourself, because the other thing too, I think, to Javier's language of active, if you turn unconditionality on you, then you always have work to do basically every day, all the time. But you see, and also here's the thing. One of the problems is with like, I unconditionally love people, it can become a status thing, or it can become a pride thing. Oh, look at me, I unconditionally love people. Oh, I'm open to everyone. You're like speaking in a language of extension, which then puts it in the realm of the social to where you get like a high five and you know, all that stuff, right? But if unconditionality is on you and it's your own work, no one may congratulate you, no one may care, and it might really, really suck, and it might make you vulnerable like Sonia at the end of Crime and Punishment, but that's the way. Like, that's what must be done. And that's where I think we can see unconditionality in its proper context, where it's not a denial of the conditions of reality. It's a denial of the righteousness of ignoring the work that needs to be done, that you need to do so you can be open to it. So I think that changes the character.